Live.
Okay, folks.
Okay, so we're starting today. This is Brian Lance, and I'm here with Evelyn Lance, and we're going to be presenting today on our trip in May, 3-week trip to China, where we covered a number of key cities: Beijing, Xi'an, Shanghai, and others in between. I think just to start out, I mean, we arrived there at the beginning of May after the new tariffs were imposed on Chinese exports to the United States, and after the announcement of the severing of business with Huawei on so-called national security grounds. So we arrived at a tense moment. Today, here we are now in August, and we have the crisis in Hong Kong. Margaret Wong, the former head of the UN Health Organization, who's a native Hong Konger, said this looks very much like a colored revolution. In other words, being orchestrated from outside Hong Kong. And the government of China has not only said to the United States to basically stay out of the situation there, but most recently issued a similar very harsh warning to the so-called United Kingdom, Britain, to stay out of the Hong Kong affairs. These are some of the forces orchestrating developments there. And of course, a number of the so-called demonstrators, leaders, have met personally with Pompeo, with Bolton, and others in Washington, D.C., as well as with U.S. diplomatic representatives in Hong Kong. So this is not at all an auspicious situation for U.S.-China relations. So where our efforts internationally on the part of the Schiller Institute and the work otherwise parallel of LaRouche PAC are extremely important to bridge these artificial differences. These are efforts to drive wedges between the United States and China in particular, just as Russiagate was initiated by the British, has become more and more clear. What we in fact specified, pinned down more than 2 years ago, it's now very clear that the entire Russiagate operation was launched to drive a wedge between the United States and Russia. The key here, of course, the overall solution that's required is a U.S., China, Russia, and India alliance, a four powers agreement to move forward with a new Bretton Woods, this time recognizing the absolutely essential concept of sovereignty of all nations, but undertaking a financial reorganization, including the implementation of fixed exchange rates, and the creation of national credit systems and cooperation among national banking systems to foster technology transfer and development to all nations in the world. That's where we need to go. So Evelyn and I were in China in May, as I said, for 3 weeks, and we're continuing that work here, as are many of you, and many more should take part in this. We have copies here for people that don't have access to it otherwise. I just published an important paper on the response of leading American universities to the witch hunt that's been undertaken against Chinese scholars and Chinese students and Chinese American scholars and students here in the United States. And that's available on the EIR Executive Intelligence Review website, larouchepub.com. Yale, Caltech, MIT, University of Michigan, University of Pittsburgh, the list goes on. The presidents and chancellors of these universities have issued statements ripping the efforts to undercut international collaboration in basic scientific research, and that includes applied research. We've had the forced resignations, in a few cases firings, but otherwise resignations. I say forced because leading researchers have just thrown up their hands and decided to leave. These include top researchers in areas such as Huntington's disease, cancer research, leading people that have been forced out because they have Chinese surnames. And this is being carried out from the very top by Christopher Wray, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but with the help of people like Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Marco Rubio, who are working with the same people, right? Pompeo, Bolton, and so on, that have are involved immediately now in this Hong Kong affair, this Hong Kong crisis. And so it's very important that these university leaders are speaking out and saying, no, we cannot have walls thrown up to break what is critical now in fundamental research in so many areas, including in space research. We'll soon be publishing, I believe Marcia Freeman will be publishing soon, a report on the history of U.S.-China collaboration in space. Most people think that there is no history of that, that there's just been this, there was the Wolf Amendment, similar actions, and there never was established U.S.-China collaboration in space, when in fact there was collaboration over decades. So that will be coming out soon in our publications. Americans need to know more about this. But one of the important aspects of presidents and chancellors of American universities, Caltech, MIT, and others, as I mentioned, speaking out, is that this itself reflects a deliberation, a discussion going on, which we're playing a role in, among, shall we say, intelligentsia, or at least people that should be intelligent, and concerned about the future of education. You know, if you want to undercut American academic endeavors, scientific endeavors, if you want to dumb down further the students coming out of universities, start throwing up these walls. So let's move on quickly here, because we have a lot of ground to cover. We covered a lot of ground in China, and I want to try to stay away from a travelogue, but also give you a sense of China in the process. As I said, when we arrived there, this is our heading over there to China on one of the airlines, American Airlines, and there's Evelyn coming down the aisle. You know, it's a 12-hour trip roughly this is from San Francisco over to China by plane. So, but when we landed there, I mean, we were coming into a very difficult situation. We were taken aside when we got there at the airport. I was, since I knew our hosts there in the city, that just said, look, we had certain, in so many words, we had arrangements for you to, the two of you, to participate in colloquia at, you know, this university and that university and so forth. But when we called them back, or we were contacted back, they said, well, you know, it's not appropriate, or we don't have qualified personnel to meet with them, you know, and so different excuses. But the point was, the environment had chilled very significantly, and that's what we were being told. That didn't prevent the trip from going forward. This is where we stayed. We stayed in a small, we roughly equivalent of a motel in the United States, in Hutong, in south part of Beijing. This is where our trip started out, in Beijing. The hallway down on the second floor, and around the corner, and our room was down this hallway. and the internet connection was a little fuzzy. You could take your choice. If one didn't work, you could jump to another. But you know, we just to make clear, we were not. This was not. We were not.
5-star.
Yeah, this was not 5-star. But you know, but very amicable, very collaborative, and that's a view from the second floor looking down into the to a lobby level area. Many of the people living there are actually permanent residents, you know, and not just tourists or that kind of thing. So it's a mix.
What's like a price for you for one night?
That roughly around $40. Would be roughly, you know, roughly. And when we walked out the next day, or actually later the same day we arrived, this was just looking down a nearby street that we were in the southern part of Beijing. And when we walked the next day down, taking a walk down towards a historical site, the Temple of Heaven, this was a garden just along the way. I mean,
Wow.
There was beauty everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. For those who have, you know, if people are still thinking partly in terms of little Mao jackets and you know, kind of Stalinist era decor or whatever, it's. I'm not saying it was ever exactly that way to begin with, but it certainly is not that way today. I'm going to skip. This is in terms of the Temple of Heaven complex, which is a Taoist temple created back under the Ming Dynasty. The main temple is the Temple of Harvest, and this is where the emperor held annual rites, you know, for wishing for the best of harvests and so on and so forth, and entire rituals were performed and so on. Here again, these are rose gardens in the middle of this, you know, this vast park. This is the main temple itself there to the right. That's an entirely wood structure without nails, built on top of that marble base. And as you can see, it's quite a tourist attraction on the part of Chinese citizens of Beijing, but obviously from around the country as well. This is a close-up of the temple itself. And you're seeing some motion there. I don't know how that motion is creeping in, Mike, but we got a little video there. But it was not always this way. I just want to point out, this is some pictures of what was the musical center for this complex, because you had musicians that played for these different events, you know, solemn music appropriate to the occasion. But this is the condition under which these buildings had fallen, and there was then an effort to begin the restoration process. And so this is just one shot of it today, one of the stelae there, probably from a place there by a former emperor. But the restored buildings, and within it there's the destruction, the presentation, the history of the development of the 12-tone scale. It's very similar to the well-tempered scale, but it's an even pitch scale. And you have there many sets of instruments. This is just one example. These are the set of the famous bells, you know, the well-tempered bells. Now this is a scene, and again here you see some motion here. We'll skip the sound, but this was just happening there in the park. I'm sure it happens every weekend, but these were people who were just gathering to sing songs. You know, these were 2-part, 3-part songs, I think it's fair to say. You know, and obviously not all the people knew all the songs. You could see them kind of helping to instruct other people to stay in beat and so on, and pick up the tune and so on. But this is just to give you a little insight into some of what's going on, and of China culture that you may not be aware of. This is just driving down the street in Beijing, one of the major thoroughfares, not really a freeway exactly, but a major thoroughfare. And note what's behind there. Flowers, roses. Miles and miles and miles of roses down these main thoroughfares in the city, and other flowers, other as well. This is a close-up of this. All well tended, in bloom, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's just a little bit of coming into Beijing. We'll come back to Beijing, the city, in a minute. We were then taken by friends, by Serena and her son Danny. Their the American English given names they adopted, to the Summer Palace, which is not the original Summer Palace. The original Summer Palace was destroyed by the British and French, but the second Summer Palace that was then built in the Qing Dynasty. But these are just, that's an example. This is, it's around Kunming Lake, which is a reservoir built in the 13th century to provide water to the growing city of Beijing. Beijing was already over 1 million people at that time in the 13th century. Beijing was considered the largest city in the world, probably. These things are a little kind of iffy, but probably the largest city in the world in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, at least. But anyway, this is the Kunming Lake. This is to the northwest of Beijing proper. But the reservoir, in turn, provided water into the city, and then the Summer Palace was built there as well. And so this is now, of course, a huge city park. There's a small fee, it would be roughly $3 or $4 in American dollar terms, and full of families and so on.
Are those weeping willows?
Yes, what we would call weeping willows. Yep, and lots of other
Although
trees
if you're
too.
over 65 in China, most of these places let you in for free.
Yeah, yes, that's true. And this is one of the a major bridge, a very significant, beautiful bridge, which is connecting one part of the park to another, to an island off the shores. That's a little bit about the bridge, the 17 arch bridge.
Wow.
Shichi Kong Chao. And here's walking along the waterways, and of course there's lots of people and shops, buying little things to eat, and children and so forth. Very lively. We were considered something of a novelty. Not so much in the cities, but we'll come back to it later on. But not so much in the cities. This was a rare occasion, but it did occur. Anyway, so a group picture there. Here's a scholar stone, Gongxi, scholar stone. China has you find these all over in the not just in the around the say temples or emperors' palaces or those sorts of places, but stones are collected and always have been collected. There's discussion of the soul of a stone, what it shows, what it tells of history, how it speaks to you. Poetry is written about stones. It's a feature of Chinese culture worth exploring. But these fantastic, the more fantastic the stones, in some sense, the better to explore. And peonies, a flower of prosperity, a garden there along the way, a restaurant we visited. Okay, moving on. Here's one of our hosts, a dinner. You may be wondering about that. Well, that's a little rabbit, and what is it? It's basically mashed potatoes. A novelty. This is not traditional Chinese, but nonetheless, this is there's always experimentation going on. And we got to one of the Peking Opera.
Can you turn off the overhead light so we can see a little bit better? It's a little dark. Thank you,
Oh, can you see better now? Did that help a little bit? Oh, okay. Uh, uh, this is Hugong Hall, actually built in the 1860s. The actual history of Peking Opera is, as it's called, as opposed to Beijing Opera, it's called Peking Opera still, at least that, as I understand it. But it has a history of about 200 years, although the antecedents elsewhere in Anhai and other provinces goes back much further. But this was formerly a home of a wealthy family in China who had this as their personal theater for Peking Opera. And so there we had a chance to watch Peking Opera, and of course they provide notes and so forth, and to follow it. And they're very interesting stories. They're like fables, I guess, in some sense.
Parables.
Parables. Yeah. So this is just some scenes and acrobatics, as well as the music. There's acrobatics. Both of these figures, one a man, one a woman, both have swords. You may not be able to catch it, but they're both swinging swords, all carefully choreographed, exactly. And everywhere there's still construction going on. You know, Beijing is a very lively city. We're headed out of the city. We're going out into the countryside, and we're going up to one of the Great Wall locations. This is the Wanghua Chung location, Yellow Flower, Wanghua. Chung village, really. It's a village within a larger town. That's the larger town down below. Here we are on the wall, so we did those kind of things. And this is
that from Beijing?
This is about 40 miles out. I chose a location which was further out to get away from fellow tourists. And but this is a beautiful location, chosen for that reason, with these lakes. Actually, part of the Great Wall here is underwater because it's the reservoir, was created and filled up. So you can actually see part of the wall underwater if one chooses. Now this is just going back to Beijing here very briefly. That's Kunming Lake there, the large body of water more or less in the center of the picture. Down to your lower right, kind of diagonally across the screen is the city of what shall we say, a drawing of Beijing proper, of which in the middle is the actual Forbidden City, and of course the city then around it.
Inside Beijing?
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Beijing, yes.
From what period?
Oh, this had to be from the, well, this is a drawing done in the 20th century. Looking back, you can see this is like a tourist map, but it's taken from an old drawing. The mountains up there are the mountains from which water comes. Water in the forms of river. Chaohu River is now the major river that brings water into Kunming Lake and also into Beijing itself. And you see in Beijing itself, I'm just going to reach over here, you see here bodies of water that run alongside the Forbidden City, which is right in this area here. So all of this is all a part of what feeds the parks and so on and so forth of the area as well. Now Beijing, this is just running through here quickly, a few pictures of what downtown, this is a city of 20 million plus, right? This is one of the largest cities in the world. So this is only a small part of it. This goes on and on. But these are just to give you an idea of some of the architecture built in different periods, obviously. Just to give you a feel.
Are those condos?
Yes, apartment buildings. Condos, yeah, condos actually
There
more.
are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, point to some. Okay, thank you. Okay, and you have these mixes of architecture as you see here. The pagoda type finishing on the top, and this design of a more traditional, 1950s, 60s style building down below. Lots of experimentation in architecture, how to develop styles that actually, you know, are beautiful and bring architecture forward in the sense of modern style and incorporate modern architecture. Look, China didn't have skyscrapers. You know, this is what you see in the Forbidden City. We'll come back to that in a second. So it's Western technology that's adopted to build skyscrapers, and then so how do you design them to give them Chinese characteristics, shall we say? So lots of different styles, and this is not a traffic jam. This is a stoplight in a major thoroughfare. Although there certainly traffic jams exist, but not in an extraordinary way as far as we saw. Now this is the little street down to our hotel motel, just to give you a sense of that. This is next door. I mentioned this to somebody the other day. Here's just a little house. I don't know what's in this. Maybe somebody can read the Chinese characters, the Hanzi here, and tell. But
maybe Esther can.
Maybe Esther can. But anyway, if you note, on both sides are Christmas trees, decorated year round. So anyway, this was like our next door neighbor to our, and then across the street is the Hyde Courtyard Hotel, complete with bar. We didn't visit. It's just a small little hotel, but they tried to dress it up in a kind of English style, you could say, a blend of English and Chinese. This whole section of this is the south side of Beijing, where when the Manchus came in and established their dynasty, they drove the non-Manchus out of the area around the Forbidden City and the dwellings in that area. And so the Han Chinese were forced to move south and quickly throw up again their businesses and homes and so forth. And so this is one of the ways in which these hutongs got created. That's an altar in our little hotel. It's very much a feature of life there in different forms. What there was a question? Nope.
Oh,
Okay.
I just said, how did they drive them out?
Voluntarily.
I don't know. I wasn't there. They were told to leave. You know, the Manchus were pretty clear about.
They won the war.
Yeah. We breakfast. We would pick up some baozi and yotao, dough sticks, and then the baozi are stuffed with pork and other flavors. You get a dozen of those baozi for a couple of dollars, and dough sticks something for less than that. So that would be breakfast, along with, for Evelyn, coffee.
All right.
Here is McDonald's coffee. This is how you get it. It's all packaged up neatly,
Oh, that's funny.
sealed at the top, everything included, at your local McDonald's stand.
There you go.
Okay.
Really, literally?
Yes.
Really?
Literally, you were kidding.
Down
Okay.
2 blocks or 3 blocks of where we were
Really?
staying.
Oh, gosh.
And we were not staying in a particularly a tourist area.
Uh-huh. Did they have McDonald's veggie rolls?
I can't tell you. The only thing we went there for was coffee. So had to have a coffee in the morning. That was de rigueur. So this is okay. So here's I believe this was on a weekday. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, this is going over to Tiananmen Square,
It was a weekday.
Hmm?
It was a weekday.
It was a weekday. So here, this is a weekday. This is in May. People are not in a holiday, and it's filling up. You've got some Anglos, but mainly you're talking about native Chinese families coming to to visit what was formerly known as the Forbidden City, now known as the Palace Museum.
If you take as long with each of these, it's going to be about 4 hours.
Oh, okay, all right. So, and so here we are going in. Now this is all wood construction. It's been rebuilt a couple of times, you can imagine. The main thread has always been lightning. At the top there of those, each one of those is about maybe 4 tons.
Wow.
There are no nails, and they're built. The construction, the donghole construction method. Donghole, huh?
How do they connect them if there's no nails?
Cross tenders that are cut in and fit together. You can think of them a little bit like Lincoln logs or something, but they're flexible. So even with earthquakes and so on, these structures stand. They absorb the earthquakes. Even the likewise the harvest temple that we saw earlier, as high as that is. That withstood all these earthquakes. I mean, there's been hundreds of earthquakes in Beijing, and it also means they can be quickly rebuilt and reassembled and so on. Yeah, Mark.
I noticed a prominent portrait of Chairman Mao.
Oh.
Are any of his little red books in circulation still? Did you notice any of that?
Nobody carries them around. You hardly ever see a statue on a few campuses. You see a statue to Chairman Mao. He's more, I would say he's more venerated today as a poet than he is otherwise. But he's not somebody that's dissed. He's still an important figure in Chinese history. Anyway, so and these pots are all over the place on these bases for water to put out fires if they did break out. And these ornaments on the rooftops, of course, are to scare off evil spirits. Red is the color of prosperity. Gold is the color of the emperor. This is all part of the, and this is the moat around the. That was the moat around the Forbidden City, and this is around Beihai Lake, Beihai Lake, which is one of the 3 lakes through the city. More roses. This is going through the university area on the northwest side, where Renmin University, Peking University, other universities are located. This is the entrance to the Shenhua compound, where after passing security, we were invited in and gave an extensive presentation. This is about half the room. The other half goes down the other way off the screen. And this was, an intensive discussion. This is part of the reason we were there. Obviously, important reason to be there was discussing with what were senior people in Chinese think tanks regarding U.S.-China relations. Many of these people seated around the table are people. I don't think I have another picture. No, that's fine. But were former heads of bureaus for Shenhua around the world. So these are very educated people. Most of them spoke and understood English. We had translators here to our right. There was 2 translators. We kept very busy, and it was a very intensive discussion, but very cordial, very friendly. When I spoke before the same grouping, it was different people, a different mix of people. A year ago, it was quite tense, animated and tense. This time, ironically, even under the circumstances of the increased tensions between China and the U.S., it was the opposite. And of course, there's a great deal of respect for the Schiller Institute and knowledge of the work of Helga Zeppler-Roush and the Schiller Institute. Moving on, this is the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and Evelyn there, and we went there to see the actual Leonardo da Vinci exhibit that was going on at the time. This is way up on the north side of the city. I mean, this was like an hour drive to get up there. but we went up there. These were on the paving stones that direct you to where the exhibit was going on. This was not. We asked some students along the way. They didn't even know the exhibit was occurring. I mean, this was not a major art exhibit in the middle of the city. This is off, out of the way. But you know, this was co-sponsored by the Italian government and the Chinese government, and it went on to tour other cities in Asia. But these were full-size digital reproductions of all of Leonardo's work, you know, in just incredible detail. You know, something you could never see. You know, as they paraphrased it, an impossible encounter with Leonardo da Vinci. Just a couple of examples there. Back to Tiananmen Square, and this is some of the decoration. You know, people think of Tiananmen Square and they think it's empty. I mean, it's always full of people. But this is some of the flowering decorations that surround the Tiananmen Square. This is the memorial to the martyrs of the revolution. These are people, speaking of Mao, these are people lining up first thing in the morning. It winds and winds around to visit the memorial to Mao Zedong. This is another picture of this, not only just of Tiananmen Square, looking onto the gate to the Palace Museum. Another picture of a McDonald's right off Tiananmen Square, and next door was so these are mixed in. They're not everywhere by any means, but they're just a humorous sidelight.
Yeah.
And a grandmother with her child, the child riding her little three-wheeler, walking down the street. Very much part of what you see everywhere. Shops. This is the Museum of History of China. The whole Tiananmen Square complex, modern complex, was built and completed by 1959 in 10 years. All these buildings to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the revolution, the creation of the People's Republic of China. And it's a huge museum with enormous exhibits on art and history. At the time, of course, we were there. The Asia Dialogue of Cultures was going on, and so there were special exhibits with contributions from treasuries, as they say, from all along the Silk Road. This is a reproduction of the tablet of Admiral Hu that he took to Sri Lanka in what is it, 1449 or 1439, thereabouts, which is in 3 languages. Hold on a second. It's worth just noting. The Gai Li trilingual inscription, 1409, is when it was brought to Sri Lanka. It's in 3 languages: Chinese, Tamil, and Persian. And it offers, there's offerings to Buddha, Allah, and the Hindu god Vishnu in the text. And here's the statue for the exhibit from Greece.
Wow.
From the Acropolis Museum. So this is this I put in here because China's been contributing for decades to archaeological projects throughout Asia and beyond. And this is an example of, in terms of Angkor, Angkor Wat. And modern architecture, this was another exhibit there. This is one of their leading architects. I mean, again, this experimentation. And this is...
LBJ?
No, this is Deng Xiaoping's cowboy hat on exhibit, the one he wore, that he was given and wore in Houston in 1979, 40 years ago, the famous hat. So it's on exhibit right there in the Museum of History. this is not everywhere, but of course around Tiananmen Square, I mean, this is the center of the capital of the country. You have these soldiers marching together. The soldiers, I'd have to say, average about 6 feet in
Oh, yeah?
height. And now we're heading out of Beijing. This is the train station, the old West train station. And we're going to be taking the high-speed rail to the next stop.
Yeah, this may end up having to be a two-part class. I'm going to spell the name of the city since I'm sure I'll mispronounce it. But I want to ask here, how many people have heard of the city of Taiwan, China? Taiwan.
Pronounce it.
Huh?
How do you say it?
Taiwan. How do you say it?
Taiwan.
Taiwan. I hadn't heard of it.
No.
No, but we
Taiwan.
but now I know it very well.
Taiwan.
You know, and we kept talking to people, and they would say Taiwan, that is English, you know, speaking people. But it is a major industrial city, about halfway. If you go southwest, I guess it is, to get to Xi'an. You know, it's about halfway between Beijing and Xi'an. And we stopped there because Brian had gotten to know a family there who had helped him out the last time he went to China, and they invited us to come stay. Now, to give you an idea of the difference, one of the differences between China and the United States. This is a medium-sized city in China. Population is estimated to be about close to 4 million.
Wow.
Now, Houston is the 4th largest city of the United States, and our population is estimated to be 2,300,000.
Yeah, but the size is based on the expanded area.
No,
No.
no, these are
The
just the
metro area.
actual, I got the populations for the actual metropolitan city areas. So it gives you an idea of what the, you know, what you have in China. Now this is coming in, we came in on the train. I don't think Brian put any of the pictures of the train, although I looked up just to try and check my memory how long it takes to get from Beijing to Taiwan. And on Google Maps, it's of course in driving, and it was almost 6 hours. On the train, it was about 3 on the high-speed rail.
Those are
And
apartment buildings?
apartment buildings.
Wow.
You see them as you're going on the train, you see them everywhere as you're going by. When you come into every city, you see them. As you're going out of every city, you see them. There are lots. And they're building more. You also see construction cranes all over the place. This is 2 of the 3 members of the family who invited us to stay there. This is Liu Bao, who had taken Brian at the request of another friend. And by the way, the Chinese, we didn't meet one hostile person. The graciousness and the generosity of people in China was just overwhelming. That's their son, who goes by the English name of Leo. He's just was just graduating from high school, and this is their home, where they had invited us to stay and cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and everything else. But also then to guide us to an area. Now, just to tell you a little bit about, and that's part of their home. Just to tell you a little bit about the city, it was the, oh no, I want to come back to that, sorry. It is a major industrial city. It is several industrial districts have been created recently. They include iron making, steel making, engineering, machine making shops, large chemical industrial complexes, and local coal production is considerable and has been used in large thermal plants. They're also a regional communication center, and it's a educational center. So you have all of that in one city, and you have something called the Jinsi Temple, which is the oldest, one of the oldest complexes that exists in China. Now, I'm not sure what all that's about.
Poetry on the walls.
Poetry
Ancient
on the walls.
poetry.
That's one of the attractions there. This is you know, as you're coming into that complex. The Jinsi city is the most prominent temple complex of that part of China. It is, well, I'm trying to get this is going in, and there were children learning how to draw. There were just hundreds and thousands of people everywhere, almost always Chinese, large numbers of Chinese tourists. That's what the children were drawing.
Buddhist temples?
It's a temple.
Ancestral temple.
It's an ancestral temple. It's yeah, there's a statue which I'm about to tell you about in just a minute. I left my phone over there, which has the information in it. But it was the Jinsi temple was originally built in the period of 300 to 500. Yeah, this is basically 2,500 years ago. That's when this goes back to. And this statue is from one of the periods when there was a war over who was going to be running the country, who the emperor was going to be. And the man in the middle is the original Tang emperor, and his name was Li Shimin. And he and his generals staged an uprising against what they thought was an unjust dynasty, established the Tang dynasty, and then later generations built these bronze statues to him and his generals. So it's a big, prominent statue. And there were, you know, I tried to figure out the dynasties while I was there, and it's just impossible. You're talking about 5,000 years of history. You're talking about in this one area, 2,500 years of history. You know, long, long periods. And I asked one of the people that was one of our guides, and we had all kinds of people from engineers. The family that hosted us, both engineers, he and she, both retired in their 50s, although she was going back to work on a project because she's very skilled. But, you know, I asked one of them, well, what do you think kept China together as a civilization for 5,000 years? You know, and it was kind of interesting because they didn't really have an answer to that question, but at least for the last 2,500 years, I would say Confucianism, which we'll get to, you know, when we get to that city. Now, this is called the Flying Bridge, yeah. And it's a unique, this was a bridge that when it was built was a new kind of architecture. It's the only one of its kind that now exists. This is over this never aging spring, they call it. I don't know why these are funny. And this is the temple of, it's called the Holy Mother, the Sacred Mother. The, you know, have different translations in English, but an old temple that was built from 1023 to 1032 during the Song Dynasty. And the incredible thing about it is these statues, which were actually were created to look like the individual members of her household, all the different servants. It's not like just some bland face where it could be anybody. They're absolutely extraordinary, and this goes back, you know, a very long way.
Over 1,000 years.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether they're contemporary with when the thing was built.
I think so.
So yeah, that would be about 1,000 years. That's me and Leo. That, I believe, no, that's not there. That's the one that's leaning over is the 3,000-year-old cypress tree. And this is called the father and son tree because this tree, the son, is helping to hold up the father tree, but which is still alive and well, 3,000 years old. I mean, you're just permeated with a sense of history.
Yeah.
And yet, you're also permeated with a sense of progress
Yeah.
while you're in China. It's very striking that they're both existing at the same time. This is the Flying Bridge again.
You said there was something unique about the bridge?
It was a unique, they said, how'd they put it?
The architecture, how you say it.
It's the oldest stone bridge of its kind left in China. So architects come there to study it.
And it was the first of its kind, right? Yeah. I think it was the first of this kind also, and it's the oldest of this kind. Yeah, so it's come, and I don't seem to see here, you know, exactly when it was built.
The arch construction or something is what makes it
Well,
unique.
part of it is stone. Stonework is not something traditional in China. You know, maybe as the basis of things, but not in actual construction. And, you know, it goes back to the development of civilization along the two rivers. You know, where you build things over the water.
The Yangtze and the Yellow.
But also you'd have the flooding continually, so you had to continually rebuild, and you had earthquakes, and you had plenty of wood. And so wood construction is what you found, including those buildings you were saying there, they were all wood construction. Right?
Those buildings, those are good. But this
Is
is
this
stone.
still in the temple city, Evelyn? Is this in the temple city?
No, this is Jinsi.
This is Jinsi.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
The
Jinsi.
Jin Temple, yeah.
Yeah,
And it's a temple complex.
Yeah.
complex.
Temple
You know,
and park
it's a huge, I
complex,
mean,
yeah.
we walked maybe, 5 minutes just to get to the entrance from where you park, because all these things are, that we visited, or many of them, like the Summer Palace that Brian was talking about, or the, Forbidden City, or other things, they're beautifully created areas which include gardens and buildings and statues and rocks, and so that you have, it's like a symphony, the way they put these things together. And so this is a temple complex, and then the structure known as the Hall of the Holy Mother, which was the one I was just showing you, is one of the most famous parts, which goes back about 1,000 years. The cypress tree, which goes back 3,000 years. The bridge, which is somewhere, similar to the Hall of the Holy Mother, is also the never-aging spring, it's called, which actually we couldn't get very good pictures of, I don't think, do we? That's goldfish. That's they have that. And this is, and everywhere we went, this little girl, I had gone to get some water or something, which I was often doing, and so Brian was sitting there, and of course you got two tall blonde Americans, so we were fairly obvious to everybody. And in this case, there was one tall blonde. So the mother brought the daughter up to Brian to practice her English. And then, of course, they wanted to get pictures with us, after practicing English, and the English was good, just about everybody. Now, this is in another part of the city. They're having, or may have had in August, I think it is, isn't it? Having some kind of
athletic competition.
youth athletic competition, and they were sprucing up the city for the people who would be coming in for the competition. And Brian, who is a gardener, was particularly impressed. They were planting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trees, and as you can see, not just small trees. They had crews out all over the place, planting these trees. And
water tank truck.
watering the trees.
Yeah.
There's a delivery here.
Okay. And as somebody asked about Buddhism, as we were driving back from that temple complex, the Jinsi temple complex, Brian noticed something that said one of the largest Buddhas in Asia down this road. So we made a decision to go see it, because you have Buddhism, you have Confucianism, which is not really a religion but a moral code, Taoism and other things all mixed together. And when we were walking up to see the Buddha, because of course it's way high on a mountain, that is not snow. This was May. This was some kind of willow or something, which was dropping, dropping things off the trees so that it looked like snow in May.
Wow.
It's quite extraordinary. And that's the Buddha.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if you can tell in this picture, but the bottom of it is older than the shoulders and the head. because when the Japanese occupied China, they liked the Buddha, so they cut off the head and the shoulders, took it back to Japan.
Wow.
Oh.
And it is still in Japan, but the Chinese said, we're going to rebuild it. So they built a whole new one, you know, and put it back up there.
Wow.
And one of the things that was also striking to me, when we were at the area that Brian was talking about, the Temple of Heaven area with the music hall and other things, and you know, the French, the British especially, and the Japanese constantly degraded and desecrated the most, you know, the most sacred, the most important to the cultural areas of the country. Whether it was by taking a Buddha away, or by having their soldiers, or the you know, even the restroom facilities in sacred temples. You know, the British did that, the Japanese did that, and yet, you know, there's some, I mean, obviously there's some anger about that still, but you don't have the kind of rage and hostility, because this is precisely what Barbara Boyd was saying the other night. If you have a nation that's committed to a mission of creating a future, then you can deal with the other problems from the past. That is up at the very top.
And there's worshipers there at the base of the statue itself.
Back now, these are very educated people, and when they came to pick us up at the train station, and we were picked up and, you know, given transportation all over the place, Ibo said, "I'm going to play something for you," you know, and put in a CD of, I think it was ABBA, and some really awful, you know, modern music. So Brian kind of gently said, "Well, we really prefer classical music." So he got out. It turned out he had a whole set of Beethoven symphonies.
Right there in his car. Right?
But he never played them because he didn't understand them.
Really?
That's what
Yeah.
he said.
Even though his son had taken piano and guitar and violin while he was in school. And Brian should tell you, he ended up with a discussion one morning before I was awake with him about this question.
He brought it up. He wanted to discuss it.
Yeah, and he was saying that the Taoist, who's the Taoist theoretician?
Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu.
Well, yeah, she said that things shouldn't change. That
Yeah. That
you didn't want tension. You
why-
didn't want.
He asked me, well, why there's this tension in this music? Why should there be tension? You know, Lao Tzu, or if I have the rhyme right, said, you know, that we should seek harmony. So music should be harmonious. And so it led into a whole discussion of, you know, creativity and the tension of, you know, in creativity and so, which clearly he understood. This is part of the discussion that went on.
Oh my goodness.
That led on into the
Wow.
next day with the son and you know, going with on the piano. They have a piano, so we were going over how the piano works in terms of the keys and the relationship among keys and how you can move from one key to another and so forth. You know, just and trying to elaborate and
He has this in his living room, dining room, to work with his son on, especially on English.
Really?
Oh.
Yeah. So he has that whiteboard, you know, right there.
yeah.
Wow.
So we were. So not that it makes a lot of sense just staring at it. But you know, these are the kind of intense discussions that.
Don't they have Wi-Fi? Don't they have cell phones?
They do. Yes, they do.
Oh,
They have all
most
that.
definitely, yes. Every little kid. You know, I said to one man, well, you have to be careful with your children about these video games. And he said, that's impossible. My 2-year-old knows exactly how to use everything about my phone. So I said, well, I guess the other thing is you just got to get them interested in something better. He said, yeah, that's a better idea. And then they also have an area along the river, which is what, the Ren River?
Way. What is it?
No. Somewhere here it is. Anyway, the river, and they have a river walk, and then this is an old bell or a replica of it, which you can ring. But they took us down there. That's the
You gotta look this way. Okay.
that's the wife in the family. Bats are considered a symbol of prosperity.
Marcia, you'll like that.
Oh, yeah.
Love it. So this was surrounding a government complex, which had all kinds of bats all over it.
So I brought that back for you.
They weren't, they weren't alive. Oh, that,
Oh, yeah, go back if that plays. I don't know if it plays.
well, I think
This is along the waterfront there in Taiwan. This is working class city basically. Here's it's a 360-degree kind of.
Windy day.
Yes, what?
Very windy.
Very unusual. They said very unusual. They'd never known a day like this, so they thought it was auspicious for our visit that this was occurring. There was a reason for this.
Very hot.
Oh,
Wow. Beautiful girls.
And all those trees, right?
and they have 2 channels for the river, and we asked them why, I can't remember exactly, and they're planting more trees and they're building more, development along the river. Then they had to take us to a restaurant because he is from,
Szechuan?
anyways, it was
Yeah, no.
very hot and spicy Chinese food.
Arsa.
Which they took us to get. And then we were back on the high-speed rail to going to Xi'an.
was this maglev rail?
No, high speed.
Oh,
No, they,
300, 350
we
kilometers.
had a number of
an hour.
discussions with people about maglev rail. They had decided not to do it. It was too expensive for them to actually create. And so instead they went with regular high-speed rail.
Now they're going ahead with maglev in different forms. So on to Xi'an, and this is just along the way. Farmland, lots of farmland. You're going through farmland in between these cities, but along the way you have these industrial sites, and then periodically you're coming to cities. Some of them you stop at. The stop is like for 5 minutes, and then you're on your way again. Very just extremely efficient. Load, unload, and you're off again. Covered a farm area, right? Covered with visqueen plastic to grow under coverage. Some footage there of the countryside, rough countryside. And this is into the train station there in Xi'an. Now we're in Xi'an. We're in the central part of the country. Xi'an is the beginnings of the Silk Road, the old Silk Road. This is behind there is the drum tower, which closes out the day where the drums would be beaten at the end of the day traditionally. This is just a small part of the city. And off to the far right is the Muslim quarter, Muslim market. And this is the Muslim market at night in the middle of the week. Islamic Street, I'm sorry, Islamic market or Islamic Street. Well, I've also seen the other, but anyway. So, but busy, right? Extremely busy. All kinds of small shops, businesses. Some of them dressed up in an old style, producing bread products. All kinds of things available. This is just down the street where we had the small hotel we were in while we stayed there. Our guest, our host there was so upset about where we were staying. He wanted to move us. You need to stay in a 5-star. I'll move you to a 5-star. We said, no, we're fine where we are.
He was, by the way, a local bureau chief for one of the
news services.
news services.
Yeah. So we had lots of discussions. All along the way, we're having these discussions, collaboration, and so forth, with lots of. Oops! Now I'm frozen, Mike. I'm not moving. Maybe we froze up here.
Mike,
Hold on a
Ryan,
second.
while you're waiting.
Yeah, sure.
What's the temperature normally
In Xi'an?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge country, right? China's as large as the United States. So, and we're getting about halfway into it, a little less, but really, if you include all of Tibet, so we're only getting a third of the way in. Xi'an is very moderate temperatures. It gets down to freezing during the wintertime, but just basically down to freezing. It's cooler than Beijing during the summer. It's warmer in the winter than Beijing. Xi'an is the Xi'an area, the I guess you could say the valley is the Wei River is the river that runs through there. I think it runs all the way to Taiwan, but I may be wrong. But it feeds into the Yellow River, and the Yellow River, goes all the way out to the coast. And from Xi'an, which is protected
Fen
by
River is the Fen. F-E-N.
Oh, okay, so it's a different. They both, the Fen and the Wei, both feed into the Yellow River. Do we get this moving
Yes,
again?
it's the hotel.
Okay.
Let me just say one thing, Ron, in
Okay.
regulation that since I'm often cold, I brought long sleeved, blouses, and I brought a jacket. Out of 3 weeks, I wore the jacket one day, and I basically had to figure out when I could wear the long sleeves that I wouldn't roast to death because it was in the 80s and 90s most of the time.
Yeah. So Xi'an is moderate temperature, lot of huge valley, miles and miles of agricultural land, and that's why Xi'an became the old capital, starting with the Zhao, at least as far back as the Zhao dynasty. You're talking about 1000 BC, and so it was the Zhao dynasty under which later, around 500 BC, you have Confucius. Not here, but that's the period of time we're talking about. And at that time, Xi'an was the capital, or Chang'an, which was essentially is the same thing as Xi'an is today. An area in which the capital moved from here to here, but it's all basically in the same area. This is downtown. You can see the tall buildings, but tree-lined, very vibrant city. Very vibrant. I mean, I thought it was Xi'an. Oh, it's going to be dusty. Maybe I'll see a camel. I mean, it's the start of the Silk Road. It's nothing like that whatsoever. One of the statues to one of the former emperors. Here's a statue of Mao. I think this was near a university, but I can't recall exactly. There's a huge wall around the city, famous wall. General Stilwell even came all the way to Xi'an to see the wall around Xi'an. This enormous complex encompassing a huge city which still stands.
So the Japanese didn't occupy this part.
No. In fact, this wall, the wall around the city, they dug into it for bomb shelters. It was bombed by the Chinese, but it was never occupied by the Chinese. Or Japanese. And this is the moat around the city. Here's the rather famous statue to the old Silk Road, which were there at the head of. I just point out the figures. The figures are not Han Chinese. Some of them are. Some of them aren't. Some of them are clearly Western, like there. So it's just very interesting way in which this was all done. Some years ago.
That's not real old statues.
No,
Yeah.
that's a relatively modern one.
Yeah.
Just to point it
But
out.
that same thing with all the stuff we saw in the museums and everything reflected the same diversity.
This is the entrance to the Xi'an Museum, which is one of the two major museums there in the city. Of course, the dragon and the phoenix, yin and yang, the two. The dragon being the emblem of the emperor traditionally. The
And
dragon
the
is not
phoenix
an
of the
evil
empress.
character. The dragon is a symbol of good luck and of bringing prosperity. This is the smaller flying goose pagoda built in about 800 AD. It's shorter by about 3 meters due to earthquake that occurred 100 years or 200 years after it was built, but it still stands. And this is the entrance, to the Xi'an Museum. We're being given a tour there. You can imagine here is a city that was the capital of the in the Zhao, the Qin, up through up to
I said 14 dynasties.
14 dynasties altogether, through the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty. So you imagine this is where the terracotta warriors are, which was ordered by the first Qin emperor.
14 dynasties, it was the capital during 14.
Yeah. I mean, there's different ways of counting dynasties, so don't, you know, we count major dynasties. They're counting a lot of smaller ones, or, you know, dynasties within dynasties. But nonetheless, this is over an enormous period of hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, the Zhao dynasty itself was all told about 800 years. Can you think about that? I mean, we haven't existed, you know, think of how long our country's existed. So you have these tremendous remnants from history, you know, sculpture, of art, and science as well. I just point out, you know, a lot of this is in motion, right? These are hardly static statues, you know, in any kind of Roman sense or whatever. These are, you know, these are really living kind of characters, and look at that camel, as well as the man, you know. You know, this is the heavenly, the heavenly king, one of the ancient figures in Chinese mythology. Another one. I'm just moving through this very quickly, and of course, Buddhism comes in 600. This roughly 600 A.D. This is the large flying goose pagoda, built in roughly 650 A.D. And it's these are on the grounds of the museums, or at least one is on the grounds of the City Museum, Shan Museum. The other major museum is the Shanxi Museum, which is like the pearl of museums in China in terms of antiquities. It's there as well. We visited both. This is the Silk Road Museum, which is a private museum. Or, well, you know, I'm jumping ahead. This is suddenly we were taken up to get lunch, and this is what it looked like on the outside. Inside, it was all these little restaurants, little shops, each one run by a separate business. These are all, it's all part of their anti-poverty program. So they have all these different restaurants, right, and prospering. And here and then we were taken out to outside of Xi'an City. This is a formerly impoverished village, and they built or part of an impoverished area, which is part of a village, and they've been transforming it into this busy area of shops, inviting in families with small little businesses, or encouraging people to start businesses and move them in. Small shops to get food. There's historical displays. There's food. Here you can see the happy owner of this little place. We're eating there. And Evan got her cafe latte. And our guide, or not our guide, but our friend there, Hu Shen, pointed out, as we were walking down the street out of this area, he said, look at these cars. These are the cars of the owners of these shops. These owners have gotten rich. They're running these little shops, and they're getting rich. And they hire people to then work in their restaurants and run them. And anyway, he was playing up the point that this is part of the efforts of China to deal with rural poverty. I mean, you can see the Disneyland features of this, when you go back to see that dinosaur, which was just this was a new part of the place that they were opening up. So this is the more latest razzle-dazzle aspect.
I thought that was a Sinclair gas station.
That's next, I guess.
But they said that the Chinese families bring their children out there to see the way Chinese life used to be.
That's a good point. Very good point. It's a way of teaching the past to the kids as well. Very much so. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so we're going to the Silk Road Museum, which is actually built. This is a statue on the outside with inscriptions and so forth. The building is behind it there. This is the entering into the Silk Road Museum. This was built before 2013, before the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a private museum, and we were brought there because our friend wanted us to see. We were actually literally on the site of the West Village from which the old Silk Road began. The West Village in Xi'an, the merchant village. And this is a model of that village inside, which had thousands of shops. Very tightly managed, opened at noon, closed at sunset. You know, if you were caught faking weights or anything, you were thrown out and could never come back. The weight systems and so forth were checked every week. You know, anyway, it was a very strictly run facility, but it was where goods were brought in off the Silk Road.
Is this still Xi'an?
This is still Xi'an. This is the West Village.
What year is these buildings?
This is well, this is roughly this is certainly no later than the Han Dynasty. So the around the birth of Christ. The Han Dynasty is from 200 BC to 200 AD.
I don't think they developed the West Market that early.
You don't think so?
No.
Okay.
But, you know, maybe 500, you know, AD, something like that.
Okay. Well, by the Han Dynasty, China was the dominant, had taken responsibility over the Silk Road. They were the major factor in developing the Silk Road. So the village may have come later. So these are, again, the kind of diorama or models of that village. And again, lots of exhibits. This is again, this is Xi'an, another along the moat there inside the city. You know, beautiful architecture. Again, this blending of old and new, and a gift of a painting by a modern painter in the old style. And here we are back at the train station. Now we're going to be going all the way from Xi'an to Shanghai, which is 6 hours roughly,
About 6.5, yeah.
to Shanghai, heading southeast.
On high speed, right?
Yes, high speed. There you have it, high speed. More. And these are cities along the way. Water, lots of water. Again, you know.
That's the Yangtze right there.
Okay. And here we are arriving in Shanghai.
And this is a picture of the line. Our host, once again, you know, we have various Chinese American friendship associations, government related, private, you know, who were sponsoring us and, you know, touring us and having us speak to various people. And so they met us at the train station. Now, you can't really see it, but, you know, if you can see where those cars are going, they're going to where you can actually get a taxi. Which it probably took us, what, half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, to get a taxi to go from the airport into the city, because it's just so busy. We were going. We got
the train station.
From the train station, yeah. We got in a line, and it was from maybe here to the window to the door, and I thought, oh, that's not too bad. But when we got out the door, then the line became 4 times longer.
Nope, it's froze again. But
now,
everybody waited in line very patiently.
Yeah.
It was very organized. You couldn't just rush out the door to catch a cab out the door.
No. Now, let me just say a couple of things. Shanghai is probably the most misunderstood city in China. You know, because people hear about the westernized part of it. And it was funny because I was looking up, trying to, you know, just bone up a little bit. And I got one thing called Trip Savvy, which said, well, unlike many cities in China with long and varied histories, Shanghai's history is quite short. The British opened a concession in Shanghai after the First Opium War, which was the middle of the 19th century. That is total, as my friend Fred Hinelfeld would call it, bovine scatology. You know, this is a 5,000-year-old city. Yes, now it has obviously developed, but you know, the idea that, well, don't worry about this city, it's just, you know, brand new. They have something like 26.32 million people in Shanghai. It is the largest city in,
6 million?
It's larger than
Beijing.
Beijing.
yeah, it's the largest city in the world.
Oh, it is. I didn't.
Yeah, I
thought
didn't.
maybe- I thought maybe like Calcutta or something.
You know, it's there along the Yangtze River, which is, you know, one of the important things. Now, it's also, you know, it was the case that in the 1830s and 40s, the British, in order to sell opium to force the Chinese to buy the opium that they didn't want to buy because it was destroying their population, waged a war and forced all kinds of concessions on the Chinese, who had much less military firepower than the British did, including opening what they called concessions in Shanghai. So you ended up with a British concession, a French concession, even the U.S., German,
concession.
you know, several others. And they ended up along the river, not the Huangpo River, not the Yangtze River, but, you know, these large, very nice buildings, you know, but that's just a very small portion of what is in Shanghai. Now, we stayed at a hotel that's part of a complex called the Shanghai Institute for American
Academy
Studies.
for
Academy for American Studies.
Social sciences.
Oh, social sciences.
Is the overall umbrella.
And well, as we were traveling around China, we actually were able to get together with 3 or 4 of Brian's former Chinese teachers from the Confucius Institute here, and this is one of them in the lobby of the hotel. And she took us to a place called Hot Pot. That was the view from our hotel room. Give you a little bit of a sense of Shanghai at night. Same thing. Now, this is the we pretty much were asked to spend the entire day with this institute, speaking to a forum in the morning where there were several other speakers, then having a discussion at lunch with people, then speaking to another forum in the afternoon, which was more oriented towards students. I didn't really realize what we were dealing with until one of the young ladies who was asked to give some information on U.S.-China relations stood up and nervously said, "I had no idea that there were going to be these many important people speaking at this meeting today." So it was quite a, quite a significant group of scholars. And of course, the questions kept coming up over and over again. Why is Trump doing this? People felt very betrayed by President Trump, that they had expected there was going to be a different policy. It looked like there was going to be a different policy. And then, things started to break down. What we tried to get across was, number one, there has been a coup attempt against the President of the United States for the last 2.5 years. No one we spoke to in China, and these are people, as Brian said, former heads of their international, Xinhua International News Service, former, scholars, people who are supposed to be U.S.-China, associations, I mean, you name it, just average people. They thought, essentially, that there was a political dispute in the country between different political parties. And that's all they knew about it. What they tend to do in terms of the news they get from the United States, when you're in China, you can't get just anything on the internet that you want to. And fortunately, you cannot get the New York Times, at least not easily. But you can get the Washington Post, you can get CNN, you can get Fox News, which means you can get a whole lot of bullshit. The same stuff that people are dealing with here in terms of only without any context. Someone said to me at our California local where we stopped on the way back, well, they should just read Trump's tweets. Now, try to imagine for yourself someone who's not an American understanding what Trump is talking about in his tweets. Even if they had access to them, they wouldn't understand.
The idioms. They wouldn't understand the idioms
Right.
that he uses.
Right.
So we spent a lot of time discussing the British. And it was I thought, well, in China, there was the Opium War. They know how evil the British are, so it should be no problem. Well, turned out I was wrong. The idea that most people had was, yes, there was an evil British Empire. It humiliated China, it forced us, the Opium War, the concessions, various things. But after World War II, that was the end of the British Empire and the Americans took over.
Well, that's the
Took
comment.
over the West.
Yeah.
Took over as the international, power. And that's their idea. And so when we got picked up at the airport, when we first got to Beijing, the man who picked us up from he's the same one that pulled Brian aside and said, look, all these people are coming up with excuses because of all the tensions right now. So we were talking, and I was talking about the role of the British in the attack on the American government and the attempt to subvert the United States. And I had met him in Seattle about 6 months earlier when they had been there and we had been there. Brian had met him the year before, so this wasn't the first time we talked about this. But his response to, this is a British operation was, I don't believe that. Now, I think in the process of our discussions, because we had a lot of discussions with him, and then we came back to Beijing, which Brian will talk about. In the end, we changed some of that. But the idea that there is an actual war going on over the policy and the leadership of the United States was not at all understood. And one of the most insightful people at this particular forum, one of the younger people, said, well, it seems to me like the United States suffers from a lack of confidence. Is that why we're having problems negotiating? And it was the most insightful comment that I think I heard, while we were there. But a lot of other people in discussions, the whole question of LaRouche and LaRouche's role in providing an alternative, the reflection of that in what Trump was doing. We kept saying to people over and over, this thing, if it's going to be worked out, the problems between the U.S. and China, it will be based on the meetings around the Group of 28, where the President of the United States can get together with the President of China.
Group of 20.
At the Group of 20, yeah. And that, of course, is, on the 28. That is what happened, even though it's been sabotaged again. But, there was, I'll just say this now, when we came back to the United States from China, we had just come out of a situation in which the sense of a big crisis was everywhere. Everyone we talked to was worried about, will there be a total break between the U.S. and China in terms of all our relations. There were, the anger around the attack on Huawei was, very powerful because this is one of their most advanced technologies and the United States is attacking it. There were various things. Came back to the United States and even members of the LaRouche organization had very little sense of the crisis. Most people had a sense that things were a little bit, not working out, but, kind of off kilter, but not a sense of what a existential kind of, crisis situation, which of course Helga has continued to pound on, repeatedly. But, and one of the ways we got through, ironically, was that I gave a presentation in Shanghai here at this institute on John Quincy Adams.
Mm-hmm.
And probably got more response to that. What is the actual American foreign policy based on? And I compared the statements of John Bolton about how we're going to go invade Venezuela because we aren't afraid to use the Monroe Doctrine in our argument, to the, that was in fact the Roosevelt corollary, which had completely reversed the Monroe Doctrine. Theodore Roosevelt corollary, yeah, not the Franklin Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt corollary, in the early 1900s, which had totally reversed the Monroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine was based on the principle of respect for sovereign nation states and a community of principle of sovereign nation states working together to defend those nations against imperial ambitions. And I actually got, when I sat down for lunch, one of the people who had so impressed the young girl who gave the presentation, because of his credentials, wanted to spend the entire time. He said, I wasn't aware of this. I don't know that period of American history at all. I don't know anything about this. this sounds very, very, very important. You know, and asked that we send him more material on John Quincy Adams, you know, when we got back. So that was the nature of the kind of thing that we were involved in while we were traveling. That's two of us giving the presentation. And then, of course, being taken out to dinner.
What was the group that you were doing the presentation to?
Well, this is the Shanghai Institute for American Studies. It's an adjunct to the Shanghai Institute for Social Sciences.
They have a whole big complex there. And they, of course, took us out to dinner afterwards to a 10-course meal and something like that.
You can see how young some of these are the young kind of sponsors of our.
Very young.
Yeah, and most of these, you know, professors with their PhDs and, you know, all their qualifications were at least 20 to 30 years younger than Brian. That's the hotel, I think, area around. We have Shanghai. Now is that the art?
Well, I don't
Anyway,
know,
this
just some
one,
pictures.
we decided to walk from where we were staying down to what's called the Bund, the old European influenced area on the Huangpo River. So we went down a street called the Nanjing Walking Street. It's a totally vehicle, and it's got a combination of Chinese and European buildings along it. Very busy once again, middle of the week. This was in the storefront as we were walking along. I couldn't resist. A Chinese lady was there having her picture taken with, and she pulled me over and said, "You've got to do this." You've got to do this.
An M&M, Joel.
Now,
It's a giant M&M.
giant.
You were supposed to bring that back.
Yeah.
Where's Joel?
There is obviously a Western influence in Shanghai. It's quite high. We were told that there are 1,000 Starbucks in China. 600 of them are in Shanghai. So
You got your coffee.
yeah, and I got my coffee. Although I got in at the McDonald's.
Which was important because that's also where you could get a Wi-Fi connection. If you weren't paying, if you didn't have didn't have access to a
Now this is the Peace Hotel, and it's the famous hotel. It's now called the Fairmont Peace Hotel. It's the best known hotel in Asia, or at least it was during the 20th century. It was rebuilt in the 21st century. I looked all over the place to try and find out why it was called the Peace Hotel, and it seemed we just decided to name it that. But it was quite a famous hotel, and in the recent negotiations between the U.S. and the Chinese negotiators in July, they had a dinner at this hotel. So it's right down there. This is the Bund. This is the area, European influenced area on the waterfront. Now, did we have anything Pudong?
Go back to the last one. It'll take you here. So that's looking down, and now you're crossing over. The other side is the Pudong, the new area.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
They have built up, see that area with all the tall buildings? It's basically been built up since the 1990s. There was some small, and it now has 5 million people in it. It's it's the financial center of Shanghai now. And we took a little ferry, to go across from the Bund area to there. I was just trying to.
So what river is that?
It's the Huangpo. And then this is in Pudong. It's the Chinese Art Museum. They had an exposition in Shanghai in 2010, and this was the Chinese pavilion, and they had 17 million visitors. The exposition went on for about 6 months, and they had so many visitors that wanted to come to it that they actually kept it open for another 2 or 3 months, and then decided to make it the home of what had been the Shanghai Art Museum, which got renamed the the China Art Museum. Now this is, there's a reason why it's built that way, I can't remember.
Well, it's based on the China building block method, historically, in building buildings like the Forbidden City.
Looks inverted.
Yeah, it's kind of inverted, but it's also, anyway.
It's very interesting because one of our guides was an architect, and this was in Beijing, and he was talking about the various different buildings, and the ones that tried to just look like they were old but they were new, he hated. And the ones that just looked new and ugly, he hated. And he was talking about a discussion that was underway. How do you take how do you take modern technology and build buildings with Chinese characteristics? And I think this is a good example of it.
So what was that building again?
It's the Chinese Art Museum.
Oh.
Was the Chinese Pavilion during the exposition.
Did he like that one or did he dislike it?
I don't think we talked about that because he was in Beijing and this is in Shanghai. And this is looking down from.
This is in Pudong.
It is in
Pudong
Chinese.
area.
So is the Chinese. So is the Chinese Art Museum.
Yeah, but I mean, this really shows you what the
Yeah.
Pudong area looks like when you're there.
That's the Shanghai Tower, right? That's one of the tallest buildings in Asia. We didn't get a chance to go up on it.
Is that all residential or offices?
Both, I think. Yeah.
Right, you're looking at there's business and then there's all kinds of residential too.
Okay, we're back in the Chinese. Now, this is a famous mural, which was from when? You know, it's hard to keep track of all the days. But it's a famous mural that shows the town, you know, and all the different people engaged in all kinds of different activities. It's huge. It covers a whole wall. Like if we went from there into where our, the next office, we cover the whole thing. And then it's also animated now. This is
This is not the original.
This is not the
It looks like it's the knitting light.
Well, it would go from day to night. It's all, it's not the original, but they did up a mural of this mural, but they did it with animation so that people are moving, and I guess we don't have it. Well, yeah.
Yeah, there.
People are moving and they're, doing various kinds of things, including coming in through the city gate and, all kinds of other things.
And that's from an original mural?
Yeah.
Amazing. Do you know
An
what
original
year?
mural, and Brian's going to look up.
What year was that mural?
That's what we're going to
Oh,
find
I'm
out.
sorry. That's
Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
Now, see, you can see they're coming in through the gate there. They're coming in through the city gate.
It's based upon a famous picture.
Yeah, and when was the picture from? Is what we're trying to remember. You remember, Esther?
Maybe Song Dynasty, 清明上河图. This picture from.
The name would be
Very lovely. So what years?
The entire original is like 20 feet across, painted by a single artist.
So when
Really?
was this shown done?
It was Chu-Si. It was
Well-
1,000 to 1,300.
Okay. And these are just some of the paintings they had. This was a beautiful one of a Tibetan man offering a gift of welcome. This was interesting because this was a year or two after the end of the Cultural Revolution. This painting was painted. This was just walking down the hallway in the museum. These statues of these people in a chorus. This is Matteo Ricci, the painting of him. And then this was our guide, who's another extremely intelligent young woman who was asked by a friend of Brian's, to guide us around. She's going to be an attorney, and she was talking about the problem with Chinese culture and said, I really don't like some of the way the culture exists these days because everybody was taking pictures. We're in this thing called the U Gardens, which goes back some hundreds of years. And she said in China, if you're not on Instagram, it didn't happen. Her generation is the kind of thing they're dealing with. So Brian is still looking for the hold on, I'm afraid about U Gardens is what I'm looking for here. I seem to have lost it. Oh, U Garden, okay. It was built in 1559 during the Ming Dynasty as a comfort for a minister of education in his old age. And the garden was then inherited. It's now, of course, a public garden. It's a beautiful area, and you'll see these rocks that Brian was talking about, throughout the area. I'll just go through it fairly quickly. Rebuilt during the Qing Dynasty. It wasn't open to walk up though, to actually go up.
That's on the ground? Go back.
I don't remember whether it was on the ground or not. I'm looking for the bridge. It's called the Seven Corners Bridge, something like that. It's a more modern version of, you know, the flying bridge we saw in Taiwan. It goes across the canal. That's from our hotel during the day. Nearby, Shanghai Academy of Social Science. That was that's the overall organization that sponsored us there. And this is driving out to the train station. Now, in Shanghai, unusually, the train station and the airport is very near to each other. And every train station was like this, just full of people all the time. We went from Shanghai to Chufu. Now, I'm going to be fairly brief on it, but in Chufu is the hometown. That was one of our sponsors. It's the hometown of Confucius, 2,500 years ago. He was about 500 BC. This is the little quote-unquote hotel that we stayed in. That's the street by. That was just on the street as we were walking by the river. Now, this was the first night we were there. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of students. This is in the middle of the school year, as far as I know, in the middle of the week. But you get a sense of the reverence for Confucius that exists in China by the number of students and young people who were there. And I wanted to just quote Benjamin Franklin on this. Benjamin Franklin published an essay on the morals of Confucius in 1737 in his Pennsylvania Gazette. He published several chapters of Confucius's moral philosophy in 1737. In a 1747 letter to George Whitefield, a well-known pastor, Franklin wrote, quote, "Confucius was my example. I followed Confucius." Then 12 years later, Franklin published Confucius's works. So, and this is something that wasn't necessarily known in China. This was a group of students
But they didn't know about Franklin's affection for Confucius.
Right.
Yeah.
Going. This is this city had a city wall and parts inside the wall and outside the wall. This is going inside the wall. There were three parts to this whole Confucius complex. There's the Confucius Temple, they call it, then the Confucius Mansion, then the Confucius Tomb. So the first one is the Confucius Temple, which is a whole complex, that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, where Confucius's works were studied and, and then people were. I can't tell which ones of these are. It just gives you an idea of the complex. Disseminated. There are all these stelae. All the different emperors would put up these stelae, these posts with inscriptions on them in honor of Confucius. And very many of them. These kids, when they saw us, they wanted to have pictures. They wanted to have individual pictures. Every single one of them had a camera. And they all wanted to have pictures with the Americans. They were absolutely delightful, but at a certain point we had to hide out. Because we couldn't move ahead otherwise. You see how, what effect Confucianism has in China. It's the numbers of people and the ages of the people that are there.
What age group?
From very young to, maybe, 6, 7 years old, No, I'm pretty sure our age. That's how far it had deteriorated at one point before it was rebuilt. Another Steely. Oops, what happened, Mike?
Oh, hi.
You did a lot of walking, Evelyn.
We ate like crazy because they kept feeding us stuff. You know, these. I mean, I was telling people, you know, people would order for us in Chinese, so I didn't know what they were ordering. And then they'd bring about 5 dishes, and then we'd work our way through 5 dishes, and then
That was just the first course.
yeah. And then they'd bring another 5 dishes, you know, and I lost 10 pounds. Because it was so, you know, you did so much walking through all these places.
Is there a similarity or difference in the spicing there and here?
There is no such thing as Chinese food. You know, the food in, you know, in fact, when we were in Beijing, we said, well, what's the specialty in Beijing? And they said, well, Beijing basically took from everybody. The only thing that's probably actually unique to Beijing is, you know,
Peking duck.
is Peking duck, yeah. But, and then there are several areas where it's spicy. Szechuan, what's the other one? Hunan province? I think I've got it wrong. But where one of our hosts was from, very spicy, you know. Then in Shanghai, you had a whole different kind of, and I wouldn't say I knew all the tastes, you know, but I was familiar with them all. This is where it broke down. Okay. And then we went out to Confucius' tomb, which was really stunning. Here's a man who lived, you know, 2,500 years ago. That's his tomb. And his son and his grandson have very similar tombs right next door. And this was everywhere. This was pervasive in every, you know, old ancient building or, you know, ancient complex there was. And then we took the train, high-speed rail, back to Beijing. And that's where I'm going to go through briefly. And you can find us.
I think I did. I think that the painting mural would translate as Riverside Scene at Qingming Festival.
Yes.
Yes.
And when?
It was painted during the Northern Song Dynasty, 960 to 1127 AD, from Zhang. So that's what I can tell you about it.
By the way, I forgot
528 centimeters long, 24 centimeters wide. You could,
Centimeters?
I forgot to say one thing about the Chinese reverence for Confucius. In 1513, they moved the town of Chufu so that it would surround the temple and the mansion. It's a whole complex of buildings that the family had developed so as to protect it. So now those things are right in the center of the city, but they didn't start there. They moved the city to make sure they could protect the Confucius buildings.
and that's all the leg room. Lots of leg room on the train.
I said to
coming
Brad,
back.
why'd you have that?
Coming back into Beijing, this is kind of like the industrial side, if you will, of Beijing. Coming back in, you can see the freeways and so forth.
So you went from Tufu to Beijing?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Ah.
Chufu is like halfway, roughly halfway between Shanghai and Beijing, inland, where you're kind of cutting a diagonal straight between Shanghai and Beijing, with Chufu in between. Coming into the station there, you see the other high-speed trains, some of them lined up there. Here is the real line. I think you were mixing up the two. Shanghai, we didn't have to wait very long
Oh, yes,
for
we
it.
did.
Well, but nothing like Beijing when we got back to Beijing. This is this line. See it how it stretches forever and ever. Anyway, so then we found our way to the Hutong, where we were going to be staying, a different Hutong motel. This is down a narrow aisleway, and then you see up there what is it called? Kelly's.
What
Is
did
the
you call it
American
your
name.
reservations, Brian? Did you just make arrangements from Houston?
Yeah, that's what I did.
You did?
Yeah. And that's the door. I mean, you can't even tell what it is, but you know, but that's the hotel. And then here's inside. So anyway, and this is what, you know, looks like down these hotels. All these cars, people use mass transit. They may own a car, but they cover them up. We were invited to a restaurant in another hutong. So we found our way there with a taxi. And then we started looking around, and there's no addresses, there's no numbers. and then someone else helped us out, a young
It was
lady.
because our friend was with us. When we,
No, we had the meter there. We hadn't found the place yet. Right.
I was thinking of the other meeting.
Yeah. So anyway, down this alley, a little alleyway, we could hardly see anything. And here inside is this restaurant. I mean, this is what happens all over the place, you know. So anyway, this is a meal then that we had, another meal we had in Beijing. This is a hot pot in the traditional Beijing style. This is slices of meat, and then the hot pot is heating over candles, you know, or sterno or whatever, and so then you're dipping the meat in the oil, which is spicy oil. So it comes out hot and spicy. And there's other things as well as the meat that you add and so on and so forth. Anyway, but this was a continuation of these discussions that Evelyn was giving you some sense of that we're having here. And this was, again, here you see Earth's Next 50 Years, which we gave to one of the gentlemen we met with there as a gift. But this was, you know, this was a leading figure in finance in Beijing. It has a leading position, not that he's the government per se, but a leading position in finance. And this all told, we had about 6 hours of discussion with this gentleman, coming and going from Beijing. And I just want to use it. I think try to use it as an example of the kind of discussion processes that's underway. One of the things that we were emphasizing with him right from the start was that Lin's writings needed to be studied in China. That it would be extremely important for forums to be set, whether they were public or private, but that forums occur involving the in-depth writings of Lin, including, for example, Earth's Next 50 Years, which has the section called The Coming Eurasian World. And there was also the discussion, of what is the process going on in the United States. At one point in the discussion, Evelyn may have things to add here, but at one point in our discussions, I raised the fact that what's going on in the West, I approached this several different ways, that there was a revolt against neoliberalism, Brexit and the Trump election and all this. But I came back to saying, look, what's going on in the West right now is a revolutionary process. There's a revolution occurring in the West. You know something about revolutions. We know Rosa Luxemburg. We know the mass strike process. This is the process which is occurring in the West, and we're placing ourselves in a position of leadership in that mass strike process. China has had a revolution. And suddenly, the guys, it was like the lights went on in the guy's head. A revolution? A mass strike? That's what's going on in the West? Tell me more. Tell me more. I've got to. So for the next half an hour, we kept coming back to this in different ways as he was trying to conceptualize, that this was not, politics as usual, as Evelyn was talking about. That this was just some debate among political factions that were going on between Republicans and Democrats. That this was something much more fundamental that was going on in the West, because obviously this was something that was going on both sides of the Atlantic, which was an important concept for him to grasp.
Did you mention to him about the Occupy movement?
No.
But that was
Well, Occupy Wall Street. No, I didn't mention the Occupy Wall Street movement. I mean, yeah, that would be, you could consider that another
Predecessor.
Huh?
the
Predecessor.
initial.
Predecessor, yeah, something like that, sure. But anyway, so no, this is much more fundamental than the Occupy movement or the, or guns rights or this or that singular issue. Yeah.
Back to what you were saying about the British
Yeah, Victor.
issue.
Uh-huh.
Was there, or do you know anything about, or do you get a reading from the people you spoke with about, back in 2012, there was this murder of this British oligarch in a hotel room. His name was Neil Haywood, and it got a lot of mainstream press coverage, and it accompanied the transition of power from Ho Chi Minh to Xi Jinping. I'm wondering if it reeks of an operation, right? Kind of like Albert Nisman in Argentina. Remember that? The murder of this attorney.
Oh yeah.
So I'm just curious if that.
Well, look, I mean, I'll give you an example of one of the things that came up in the course of our discussions was the role of Freemasonry. That they're trying to understand, well, how are decisions made in the West? Well, what about Freemasonry? Which they know a little bit about and they don't know a lot about. I mean, it's a mixture, a real kind of grappling, at a relatively high level, with trying to peel the onion, shall we say. So again and again, part of what we had to address was we had to address the more profound cultural processes as we're addressing today. The question today is not, who pushed the button that caused this guy to kill a bunch of people in El Paso, or what was the button that was pushed to get a guy, in that case, a Bernie Sanders supporter apparently, and Antifa supporter, to kill a bunch of people in Dayton, Ohio. What we're addressing is the broader cultural issues that have built up, that have piled on deliberately on the part of the British and related circles to undermine Western civilization, the principles of and the American system. So
I just wanted to add, part of the reason that came up was when people started to finally realize the kind of coup operations that were going on, and that there were people like John Bolton and others, and all kinds of people in the institutions that were working against the president. They started saying, well, why doesn't he do something? Why doesn't he fire them? Why don't you change it? Why isn't And that's what precipitated this profounder discussion about the cultural warfare that's been used against the United States over all these years to corrupt both the elites and the populations.
Specifically at that point, in a number of the discussions in Shanghai and in Beijing, the discussion was around liberalism. To grasp what liberalism is, neoliberal or otherwise, but liberalism, British liberalism. That once you accept, once that the axioms are changed to liberalism, that is, to the axiom that, well, there is really no way to know what the truth is. Therefore, the truth is relative. You can have your truth, I can have my truth, but you can't impose truths on other people, right? And I do my thing, and you do your thing. And so in the West, so what are you left with as a result of this corrosive, that the truth is unknowable? This is the premise. Well, we only understand what we know with our senses. We don't actually know what actually is going on fundamentally. And so we each have, as a result of our own empirical experiences, our own insight into things. Measuring things and so on and so forth. Well, what are you left with? You're left with a dichotomy. On the one hand, it's that everybody's doing their own thing. Well, yeah, that's the magic of the free market, and that's what's, that's going on, and that's tearing things apart. And it's the counterculture that became the culture. On the other hand, the flip side of liberalism is that you then need a Leviathan. As Hobbes said, you've got to impose a dictatorship to impose any kind of order on all these people anarchistically acting out, their own thing. And that this is the dichotomy, that's come to dominate in the West, is this this is a very dangerous point that's been reached, and this is what has to be addressed fundamentally in terms of science, and that's what we're doing in the space program. The revival of the space program is because you're returning people, you're reorienting people to science, that the truth is knowable, that you have to define, you have to work at and master what the truth is. You know, as stated in the petition, we commit to the Moon-Mars mission, right? The reasoning therein. Likewise, this is what the importance of Confucianism in China is, because it goes to these deeper issues in terms of precepts, in terms of moral precepts and their basis, right? For one's action, in not just for now, but from the standpoint of your ancestors and for generations to come. This is the basis for judging your own actions, truthfully. You know, as opposed to the rabble that is Hong Kong. I mean, if you think about it, it's not accidental. Hong Kong has been, you know, inculcated with British liberalism for hundreds of years. You have a population there that, you know, very much like Sun Yat-sen had warned back in, I think it was in 1923, that if British liberalism, you know, ever took over in China, the population would turn into sheets of sand. Well, in a certain sense, that's, you know, what you see in Hong Kong. Not everybody, but you know, you see that as something that's being played, a potential that's being played. So this was part of getting our interlocutors, our dialogue partners, to think more deeply about the actual nature of empire, the empire of the mind, how you control people not by controlling what they do, but how they think. If you control how they think, then you can determine what they do ultimately, and what they don't do, and also to think more deeply about the basis of an actual, you know, ecumenical process or a dialogue process between West and East, in much more fundamental terms. So, you know, it's left many open questions. You know, I've had material from Helga, from myself, from others, posted, you know, on various WeChat sites, and, you know, circulated since we've gotten back. You know, there's a continuing dialogue that's continuing, you know, from our visits, and I'm sure from, you know, we just had recently, you know, one of our French members,
Christine Bier.
Yeah, Christine Bier was just in Western China. Helga, at the same time we were in Beijing, Helga was there addressing the dialogue of culture, dialogue of civilizations there, of Eastern civilizations, there in Beijing. Those discussions and many others. So there's a rich discussion process going on. A lot more needs to be done both ways. And that's why it's so important for us to orient now in terms of committing to the Moon-Mars mission. This petition is on the LaRouchePAC.com website. You can go there and find it. And you can also add your signature, read the petition and add your signature by texting MOON, just the word MOON, and then MOON to the number 832-430-6952. So just to finish up here, the final sites, this is around Tiananmen Square. These are the old gates into the old imperial, old city. Outside of the Forbidden City was the Imperial City, one of the old gates, the old British railway station, which is now a museum. Lights on other old buildings and new buildings, and there is the entrance to Tiananmen Square at night, and that's signing out of our Hutong Hotel. So I think that is a good place to wrap. Thank you for your patience.
Speaking of culture, did you set up the Houston Schiller community chorus tour.
We're working on it. We're working on it.
Alfred had asked what the air quality was, so
Yeah.
I didn't want to answer for him, for you.
Everywhere. I mean, we had a couple of days where there was a little bit of smog, but 99% of the trip there, it was very good. I'm not saying there is a smog problem parts of the year, but and particularly in the middle of the summer in Beijing, for example. But the whole time we were there, the weather was great.
You
By
didn't
the
see
way,
anybody.
just
yet.
everybody
Air
at the
quality.
in Chufu around the Confucius stuff, they were selling these, you know, and it was very hot. So just about all the kids and all the people.
They want to say that's pretty. It's a
Hold it
flower.
up.
Oh,
Yeah, there you go, yeah.
okay. Okay.
Very good. Confucius fan.
Fans are we come out in the summer.
They're not
Sure.
just decorations.
Yes.
Although there are, as you can see at Marcia's house, there are some beautiful decorative fans.
Yeah.
But you didn't see people with masks on at all.
Yes,
like
you
you
did.
did in
Yes.
Japan.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't see
You
that.
yeah,
did?
they're in the pictures.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were lots of people.
I saw that.
Yeah, well, it's a minority, but I mean, you see people either for their own health reasons or because they're trying to protect people from something they have. I mean, it's both ways. In terms of those, what do they call it, surgical masks or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What'd you do about water?
Oh,
You boil water. Every hotel room, motel room, whatever, you know, there's always a pot there. And you fill it with water, and, you know, they got 220 voltage, and it powers up and boils the water in no more than 2 minutes.
yeah, I was the most freaked out about that because I wear contact lenses, and I thought, oh dear, you know, what's going to happen if I, you know, but it becomes a routine. You just have boiled water
And then it cools off. I mean, while it's hot, you can make tea or whatever, and otherwise it cools off. I mean, you can wash your hands and so forth in the sink, you know, with soap and so on.
Yeah.
But you know, everywhere you go in China, it's just considered that it's better not to use the tap water for drinking
Right.
and so forth.
Even
But
if-
that's the same. But in a different way, it's the same in Europe. Most places you go in Europe, you know, you drink bottled water and so
Right.
forth. I mean, it's not.
What about
Or
beer?
beer.
There you go.
Yeah.
Brian,
Yes.
what about, you said there were thousands of people honoring the birthday of Mao, right? Were you there?
Those are just people lining up
Oh, they're-
on any given day to
Oh,
go
I
into
don't
the
think
mausoleum where
the
he's.
building that was
what?
shown is the mausoleum.
Where
Okay.
and that's right there in
So,
Tiananmen
so
Square.
the conflict I have in my mind is, you know, so many intellectuals suffered during the so-called revolution of Mao. I mean, they really, really suffered. And so here, though, you have, it's very popular, they're honoring Mao. And not that they are personally, but how do you resolve that in China? How did they resolve that?
Well, I'll say something, then you're going to say something.
Yeah. Yeah, I have something to say.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, this is one way that you know, it was explained to me. I'm not saying it's the explanation. I'm just saying it's one view of this, which is not. It's held by many people. If you go through the China's dynasties, you know, the Qin dynasty was 20 years, but it was from the Zhao dynasty, which was failing over 400 years and collapsing. Then the Qin came in and took over the place and whipped everyone in shape. And they were brutal, and they whipped but they whipped things into shape.
That's
Then-
QIAN. QIAN.
QIN. Then you had the Sui dynasty, SUI, which was another one of these transit dynasties. You know, basically 1,000 years later. One way of interpreting it is that that Mao, what he undertook. Remember that you're talking about a single generation, right? Mao, right? He took China and put it through another, you know, brutal change, which was necessary, which then opened up the way for then the next dynasty to then carry forward. You know, following the Qin dynasty was the Sung dynasty, or the Tang dynasty, which is considered a high point of Chinese civilization. That's what superseded 20 years of the Qin dynasty. So, I'm not saying you have to accept this. I'm not saying I accept it. But I'm saying that, you know, when you're talking about, you know, a civilizational state like China and these transitions, it's very much seen in different ways by intellectuals in China, what actually they have lived through, what has gone through, because now they see a totally fresh process underway in China today, and they don't see that as somehow something that they see that Mao and the circles around Mao, including Xiao and Lai and so on and so forth, that they made what is happening now possible. Okay.
There's two things. First of all, Mao is not really blamed for, and I don't think he is to blame for the Cultural Revolution. That was his wife and the Gang of Four. You know, and there was a battle going on which got very vicious and brutal. But the other thing you have to realize is there was 100 years of humiliation in China. Right, from the time that the British brought their gunboats in, I think it was 1839 or 1842, you know, and started the Opium War, and China was really no longer a sovereign nation, you know, at that point. And from that point until 1949, the founding of the People's Republic of China, you know, China just went through one humiliation and, you know, controlled by foreign powers of various kinds, invasions, wars, over and over and over again. And Mao is seen as the father of the country who ended that and created a new nation.
Do they see the difference between the Gang of Four versus Mao?
Well, it gets very complex because there's all kinds of discussions going on now. We had some very strange discussions, which I won't relate with, you know, about the, you know, whole question of that transition and the, you know, the Cultural Revolution, you know, and other things. But it was clear implicitly, not so much because of an explicit discussion of it, that Mao is not blamed for the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
Deng Xiaoping himself is quoted as saying that Mao Zedong had it 60% right. You know, I mean, so you know.
Because part of that theme was an anti-Western stand, right?
It was anti-classical.
I was going to say, and there are classical musicians who actually, you know, they cried.
Well, if you were if you played classical Chinese music, you were attacked just as much as if you played classical Western music.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, no, I was going to say, I mean, they also have, the education is infiltrated and they only put what they want them to know, or what people will know. So maybe that has something to do with it as well.
Yeah, sure. It's like we're going through the same process here. We're having to sort out, you know, as we've done, you know, as an organization over the last 40 years, sort out American history because there's been so much, you know, so many stories told and so much suppressed and so on.
Not many people know about the Balfour Declaration of 1917. I mean, there's a lot of questions that go unanswered and people that just follow without actually knowing.
Right. Yeah, Sykes-Picot as well, if you're talking about the Middle East.
Well, I think it's important to think about Mao from the standpoint of the Chinese nation, as opposed to an American standpoint. You know, and that's kind of ironic because as Brian said, there weren't very many Mao portraits. There was the one at Tiananmen Square, and of course they're getting ready for the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China in October. So they're fixing up the portrait and all kinds of things, and there were a few statues, and there happened to be one. We got together with Professor Yi, the woman that headed the Confucius Institute here, and a man who is Chinese. He's a Chinese national, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the Chinese national, but he's teaching at TSU here. He spends most of his time, he deals with the West a lot, so he's kind of westernized. So this was another campus where it was very confusing trying to, because, you know, in some places there was a lot of stuff in English, and in some places there was none. We had no idea where we were going. But, so he was walking us back to meet a friend of his who was going to show us around the architect. And he said something about we saw a statue of Mao, and he said, well, in most campuses, those statues were pulled down, you know, and I said, oh, that's unfortunate. He said, oh, why do you say that? But he was the only one of everybody that we met, you know, that had a comment like that. And what we were told by our guide, who was provided to us by some of our sponsors in the Beijing area, was that there is tremendous reverence for Mao. I mean, I don't know if you noticed those wire things that were next to the people's there was a line of people standing there, and then there were all these kind of wire barricades. You know, those can be pulled out so that hundreds more people can wait in line. Thousands more people, right, to get into them. I mean, there were already hundreds, but you know, because so many people want to honor Mao, you know, as the man who ended the 100 years of humiliation.
And that's particularly true in the countryside.
Yeah.
The countryside he's venerated even more than the cities because, you know, that's where the revolution was led from, was through the mobilization of the peasantry. And the land reforms, you know, the original land reforms under in China were to give land to the peasants, to break up the big plantation, you know, what we would call plantations. So anyway, so it's very complicated.
And they're trying to figure it out. Like I said, there's a lot of discussion, which was relayed to us about trying to figure out the transition from Mao and the Cultural Revolution and Deng Xiaoping in the modern era. Because it's obviously was quite a people.
There's people that will say, you know, Mao was attacked because he was fighting corruption. He was trying to get rid of corruption, and actually Deng Xiaoping was corrupt, or the people around him. Anyway, so I'm just saying it's, you know, it's really mixed up. I mean, we can, you know, because of our as an organization, as an institution, because of our insights into history and civilization. We can help bring some clarity to these things, but again, on the other hand, we're dealing, you know, with
not understand the science.
Entirely different civilization, 5,000 years old civilization that's been through and does go through its own processes, and it's really, you got to be careful to, not for diplomatic reasons, but for truth-seeking reasons, to be very careful drawing conclusions, jumping to conclusions.
Right. And there's always a reason that a culture honors somebody when they have 5,000 years of history. You know, so, you know, my image was, yeah, but look what I mean, couldn't play classical music, look, these musicians were put in prison, and then, so, you know, that's my stereotyped image, you know. But here are these millions of people that honor him.
And they're honoring dynasties thousands of years old, and some of these guys were butchers, you know, if you wanted to break it down, you know, in simple language. So,
I know you guys aren't, you know, the greatest experts on Chinese politics and
thank
history,
you.
but it's way up there.
One of the best.
Was there? Now I got a sense when I was there. There was, I don't know if it was, I don't know how much truth there is to it, but there was a narrative that there was a big fight between Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping's faction. Now, I don't know what the truth is behind that. Was one more open to the West, and was another one more closed, or did it have something to do with the big crackdown on corruption? Anyways, I don't know if you could shed some light on that.
Is that
changeover?
it was around 2012 he was accused of.
Right.
Yeah.
He allied with the Tiananmen Square demonstrators at one point.
Bo Xilai was?
Yeah, if I'm thinking about it correctly. I was just gonna say, you know, again, look, there's all kinds of these kinds of differences, right? That can become wedges, and otherwise are something to be aware of or think about. But you know, there's this so-called Shanghai group, you know, and there's a grouping there, and there's the Beijing group, and there's the Shanghai group. You know, there's the so-called Shanghai group opposes Xi Jinping for having been too outspoken in promoting China's new assertive role in the world, that he should have followed more Deng Xiaoping's low-key approach. Well, that's also, Shanghai is also a financial center that has the deepest and longest term American connections of any city in China, major city in China. And so, you know, obviously there's people there nervous about the disruption of their long-term, American ties. And so you have, all of these frictions that go on. We know about that in terms of our own, our own organization, our own association. Just, some of these are news from the outside. Others are, just frictions, right? And you move beyond them. So, I don't, even if I'm incorrect about the person you're talking about and whether I'm thinking about the same person you are, I think that's the broader point. And to get into these, the one thing, clearly we need an anti-corruption campaign here in the United States. And what's been done in China is, we heard again and again, it's been very salutary in terms of its effects in China.
And we told the Chinese that repeatedly. We need an anti-corruption campaign.
Which they liked. That made them laugh.
The thing about Xi Jinping is that he's the one who promoted the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. That's the most important thing that he's done.
Why do they respect Kissinger so much?
Do they?
Is it
Oh, yeah.
because of Nixon's visit?
Yeah, because he opened up.
Oh.
Because he opened up relations between the West and East,
And then
between
for
China
us,
and
that's
the
a
United States.
conflict. Kissinger.
Look, I mean, it is true. I mean, the Confucian approach is to seek harmony, to catch oneself and find common ground with the other person, or in a situation, to not respond out of anger, but to use it instead as what we might call a learning experience, and think it through, and they will constantly seek in any situation, a harmonious resolution. And so in terms of think of it in terms of sustaining a 5,000-year civilization, which was not always the extent of China which it is today, and there's a lot of people. Han Chinese is not something that's existed as a term for more than a relatively few hundred years. Within the Han Chinese are Chinese that, that were Manchus, that were, came from all walks of, from all kinds of Mongols, all kinds of different backgrounds, but they're now Han Chinese. They've assimilated Chinese civilization, right? So this has been a long, sustained process. You try to get someone in China into a debating between Confucianism and Taoism, and generally their response is they're two sides of the same coin. They're complementary. They're not going to get into a fight over religious differences. That's why Buddhism was assimilated. It's why they assimilate Western ideas. Think of it. I mean, Deng Xiaoping sent out all these students. I mean, we got 350,000 Chinese students in the United States today. They're assimilating from the West, right? Maybe they're assimilating the wrong ideas, but they're, this idea of assimilation is part of this concept, of what we understand as this idea of harmony and seeking harmony, and so that's very much ingrained. So they'll look for the best. They'll look for the best in Kissinger. They might buy into some geopolitical concepts along the way, which they'll have to reject later on, but they'll attempt to maintain a connection, a positive connection wherever they can with the other, in this case with the United States.
And I think that's partly why there was such a palpable sense of crisis when we were there, because this situation is being orchestrated in such a way to create a direct confrontation between the United States and China, which nobody wants.
Right. And to become, in a way that is like almost unpredictable, because it's like, things start to appear like they're becoming normal, and then suddenly, and then, it's like just irrationality constantly.
Yes.
Did you hear Huawei's new operating system, in case they can't use Android anymore, is gonna be
Called
called Harmony.
Oh, is that right? Really?
Yeah.
Yes, they just announced it
Wow.
officially yesterday.
Yesterday, right?
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard Mr. Wren, the chief, the head of Huawei, an interview that he was doing with CNBC, and to keep it short, he said, people really don't know China if they haven't been to China. He said the problem is that most Americans, what they think they know about China comes from movies that are depicting it 100 years ago.
Yeah,
So
that's what it is.
it would be a big help if more people were able to come to China. And I think that's a
Okay,
good
let's
place
go.
to end, and we can go into informal discussion.
Okay, thank you.